Okay, welcome back to the lecture on value. This is Unit 6, and we're talking about one of the design issues for this unit, which is value and value contrast. When we last left off, we were talking about tone and how tone often, the impression or the illusion of tone is often actually still created by repetition of marks. So even in a photograph like this is an actual print photograph, and so it is made up of tiny little spots called grains. That's the way the photograph is actually made. So it is just like the previous examples, really not true tone, but it does read as pure tone. I will grant you that, and I would discuss it that way if we were, writing an essay on a test or something. But so value also can just be created purely by the difference in value, right? There is no blending. There's no repetition, right? Really, line weight is not an issue here. The value in this image is created purely by the value of the white paint, the value of the canvas, right? That's a distinct color and value from the white, and then the value of the black paint. That is it. And similarly, in the Ellsworth-Kelly, the value contrast is created purely by which color is darker, which color is more mid-value, and which color is the lightest. So what about value contrast? What do we mean when we say a work of art has a lot of contrast or doesn't have a lot of contrast? And so one of the points I want you to make is I want you to think about when we talk about value contrast, we are actually talking about two different things. One is the actual range of value, meaning the difference between the lightest light and the darkest dark in the image. And then the other thing we're talking about is how quickly in the image it goes from the lights to the darks, which I call the speed of gradation, right? But you could also call it the speed of transition, right? So value range, right? Which is, like I said, how light is the lightest light and how dark is the darkest dark, versus the speed of contrast or the speed of gradation, right? How quick is the shift from the areas of the light to the areas of dark? So here's a classic example, right? The value contrast could be looked at in two different ways, right? Overall, the Edward Weston photograph of the pepper feels like it has a greater amount of value contrast, because even though the lightest light is not as light as the lightest lights in this image, and even though the darkest darks are not quite as dark and rich as the darkest darks are in this image, and that's pretty much has to do with the type of printing that was used. But anyway, moving on. Even though the range is not actually as great in this image than in this image, but the movement from the light to the dark feels quick, right? We have very, very sharp areas of bright light on the pepper, and then very quick into these areas of deep shadow, so that the speed of gradation or the speed of contrast feels faster. So overall, the image feels like a more contrasty image. Whereas when we're looking at the artichoke, even though the actual range of value from the darkest dark to the lightest light is wider, it feels slower and it feels less contrasty because of that. Because the shifting of values is very slow and careful. We have all these slight in-between values, right? Going from the lightest light to the next set of dark values, to the next set of dark values, to the next set of dark values, into even slowly shifting towards the darkest values. There's a bit of a jump when we get from the kind of mid-value range to the darkest darks, but there is this very slow gradation, and that creates a sense of less contrast. So let's take two works that truly do have a low amount of value contrast. And one of the things about low value contrast is that painters can use low value contrast to make colors feel more rich, right? And similarly, they can use color contrast in substitution of value contrast. When we look at this image, we don't really see it as being a no contrast or a really, really low contrast image, right? Because even though the value contrast is very, very slight, there's a lot of temperature contrast, a lot of change from warm colors to cool colors. And so our brain substitutes the temperature contrast and allows us to see the image clearly. And even in this painting, where there is pretty much zero value contrast, just two different whites, the fact that one is cool and one is warm helps us really see the contrast between the two of them. Now, let's talk about how does value create emphasis. There's a lot of different ways that value creates emphasis, but the two most obvious ways are where you have an image that is overall light, and then a use of a lot of dark in certain places, right, creates contrast. So the areas of emphasis in this image are the areas that have the darkest value, because overall the image is very light and painted with these very, very faint washes of gray. So these few spots of really dark, rich color, rich value draw our attention. The reverse of that is where if you have an image that's overall very, very dark, the few areas where you have a lot of light, and therefore also those areas where you have a lot of value contrast, are the ones that draw our attention. In this particular case also, Caravaggio is literally using the movement of light as a directing element, so it adds to it. He is literally telling the story with the movement of light. He was a very clever guy, that Caravaggio. So what is value grouping? How does it affect composition? And let me say that sometimes value can function in more subtle ways, other than these two really obvious examples, in terms of creating emphasis. But these are probably the two most extreme examples I could find. One where, where our eye is literally drawn to the areas that are absolutely the lightest areas in an overall dark, and vice versa. So when we look at an image like this, I want everyone to pause for a second. Just pause for a second and really kind of stare at the image and squint your eyes, right? And keep squinting until everything starts to become kind of blurry and you lose sight of any of the individual people in the painting, and instead you start to just see the shapes. And what you'll see is that all the dark shapes start to group together in these kind of sinuous kind of snake forms that twist through the whole composition. And all the light shapes kind of group together into these larger, twisting, sinuous light shapes that also twist throughout the whole composition. And this is a definite strategy where he's trying to give us kind of a structure by which our eyes can move through the composition, and a very kind of a slow meandering structure as sort of a counterpoint to the very quick geometric structure that's already there in the composition. We'll talk more about this painting in terms of composition. We will probably see the Wrath of Medusa more than any other painting in any other image, pretty much, in this course. Let me also point out, when we're looking at Wrath of Medusa, how, once again, this is a good example of an image where it's not actually super high contrast, right? Especially lots of passages, and yet they feel like this passage right there, the range of value is not all that great, but the speed of contrast, the speed of transition from light to dark is really fast, and that's what creates the impression of high contrast. So let's look at these three images. I think this might be the end of the lecture. It is. All right, and I just want you to think about, how do these images create value contrast? One where it's a white on white, right? One where it's all monochromatic. One where it's a real extreme range of value, right? And using a lot of choices of local color to create the contrast, right? The local color of the dress, the local value of the dress compared to the local value. And also compare these two, right? Notice how in this image where it's overwhelmingly dominated by these whites and light values, the area of the really, really rich dark of her hair becomes the primary emphasis. That's my 1 minute mark, by the way, so let's see if I can finish it. And then the next areas of dark value are the secondary, whereas in Madame X it's the exact reverse. An image that's overall kind of dark and mid-darks all the way through, the area of the really, really light values draw our attention. Whereas in Gerhard Richter, it's much more dominated by mid-values, and it's through the mid-values that he's able to kind of create that kind of soft and kind of moving kind of quality. All right, that's where I'm going to end. All right, next we're going to talk about page structure.